Tigidius Perennis was the man in charge. When Commodus did climb down into the real world of politics, it was mostly to humiliate some senator or rearrange the provincial postings to keep everyone on their toes. Beginning during this period, but not perfected until the fall of Perennis and the rise of Cleander, who had recently been made chamberlain to replace the assassinated Satyrus, was the regular sale of office and the constant shuffling of office holders. Perennis and Commodus were, in a way, engaged in a friendly rivalry to see who could create the most political and bureaucratic chaos so that the dust would keep swirling and they themselves would remain safely cocooned in the center of the storm. Consulships were bought and sold, praetorian prefects were appointed and fired sometimes within the span of days, governors were sent out to provinces and learned that they had been replaced when they arrived at their new posting, and, most important of all, membership in the Senate was open to anyone who Commodus favored, or, perhaps more importantly, who the emperor thought the old senators would hate. The empire was lucky during this chaotic period for two reasons. First, the borders were relatively peaceful. The two groups who would have posed the biggest threat to the empire were the Parthians and the Germans, and they had both been recently humbled by massive defeat at the hands of the legions, and were not looking to make trouble again anytime soon. So even though Rome had become politically schizophrenic, no foreign enemy was ready to take advantage of the empire's madness. Second, though he was personally ruthless, Perennis was no administrative slouch. He kept the grain flowing, the books balanced, and the games running. It all would have fallen apart much sooner had he been utterly corrupt or a dismal accountant, but he was neither, and so the empire, while not exactly flourishing, was not yet to be driven into the ground. But discontentment was stirring. In 183, a brief war in Dacia broke out that was put down by a combined effort of the final two of the five would-be emperors in the fast-approaching year of the five emperors, Claudius Albinus and Pescennius Niger. The other three being the aforementioned Pertinax, Didius Julianus, and Septimius Severus. The next year, unrest in Britain led the commander there to press north and retake the Antonine Wall, which had been abandoned around the time of Marcus's ascension. The general in question, though, was a harsh disciplinarian who the regular troops hated, and following the campaign, they revolted against his leadership and proclaimed another commander emperor. This commander wisely refused the honor and got the troops back under control for the moment, but the next year, rebellion among the British legions flared up once again. This time, their ire was directed at Perennis himself, who they blamed for being late with equipment, stingy with pay, and saddling them with harsh masters who would not indulge the lax atmosphere they had come to expect. In a sign of things to come, that is, the failure of discipline that would soon become an epidemic in the legions, a deputation of 1,500 armed soldiers marched out of Britain for Rome, where they planned to present their grievances to the emperor in person. Missing the greater point of the precedent he was endorsing, Commodus allowed the rogue company to enter Italy and march on Rome armed to the teeth. Hearing the news that this force from Britain was on the way, the imperial chamberlain Cleander saw the perfect opportunity to make his own Machiavellian strike. With the help of some dissatisfied senators, Cleander set about trumping up charges against Perennis that seemed to show he was aiming to make either himself or his son emperor at some point in the not-too-distant future. When the soldiers from Britain arrived to present their case, Perennis was confident that he would be able to dispatch them with ease, but at the same moment, Cleander was presenting Commodus with the allegation that Perennis was planning on overthrowing him. Having hit the emperor's paranoid center right where it hurt, Commodus suddenly turned on the blindsided Perennis and ordered his former favorite and his entire family executed. Cleander then dutifully led the emperor through the list of senators who were involved in the trumped-up plot. Conveniently, they were all personal enemies of Cleander, and the aristocracy was once again caught up in a bloody purge, already the second of Commodus's short reign. The fall of Perennis would send the empire off a cliff, because while the old Praetorian prefect had been a capable administrator, his replacement as imperial favorite Cleander was nothing of the sort. Next week, the wheels will come off the bus. The art of creating bureaucratic chaos for fun and profit will be perfected by Cleander, who will run the Empire, if you could even call it that, for 5 years, while Commodus drifted further off into his own private fantasy land. Cleander will finally be eaten by the monster 30s, but will be forced to step in and actually do some real governing. But by this time, he was convinced not only that he was the reincarnation of Hercules, but also that he was the greatest gladiator who ever lived, so it's not like he brought a lot of stability to the situation. Like Domitian before him, Commodus would eventually be done in by members of his own inner circle, who were worried that they were about to be caught up in yet another round of purges. His assassination on New Year's Eve 192 will spark the first great domestic crisis since the Year of the Four Emperors, and 193 AD will go down in history with a nice little nod to inflation as the Year of the Five Emperors. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you now know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again is audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you will qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I am going to go back to the very beginning and recommend The Histories by Herodotus. Herodotus is widely acknowledged as the father of history, and though he was not exactly rigorous about his separation of fact and fantasy, he was the first writer in the Western world to really lay down a full, compelling history of the past, and for that alone, we are all in his debt. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 97, The Fall of Hercules. Okay, so last time, Maximus was totally framed by Joaquin Phoenix, and even though he was able to escape his own execution and make it back to his estates in Spain, the fugitive general was eventually captured by slave traders, but not before learning that Joaquin Phoenix had murdered his entire family. This week, now a gladiator, Maximus must fight or die in the arena, and maybe, hopefully, one day have his revenge. Okay, not really. There was no Maximus. The non-existent Maximus did not kill Commodus in single combat, and that certainly did not lead to a great restoration of the Republic. Good movie, though. And, funny enough, the bit about Commodus fighting as a gladiator was no joke, and if anything, the movie actually downplayed the Emperor's obsession. Following the purges that surrounded the fall of Perennis, the Imperial Chamberlain Cleander rose to power, and along with a circle of corrupt and decadent allies, Cleander ran the empire for his own benefit from 185 to 190 AD. During those years, Commodus withdrew even further from the real world, and when not drinking or dabbling in his harem or sitting in the baths, he spent the majority of his free time training to be a gladiator. The Emperor's obsession with gladiatorial combat dated back to his childhood and was the centerpiece of that reputation I talked about earlier, the one Marcus hoped Commodus would eventually outgrow. But rather than outgrow it, Commodus let it grow with him. Disinterested in the real work of soldiering, Commodus was fascinated with the staged fights of the arena, and from very early on, aspired to join the pantheon of gladiatorial gods. Now an emperor, and with no one to stop him, he let this ambition off its leash. Now, in the Roman social hierarchy, an emperor was at the very tippy top of the pyramid, and a gladiator was in the sub-basement, down with the prostitutes and the actors. A free citizen fighting in the arena was unseemly. An equite fighting was scandalous. A senator fighting was a barely conceivable horror. An emperor fighting as a gladiator? Well, that would be the equivalent of the president turning up one morning in a crack den. Commodus cared not a whit about the social taboos, though. He wanted to stand over 10,000 dead opponents and bask in the adoration of the crowd. Nothing else mattered. At first, he confined himself to private contests, but as he grew more confident in his abilities, the emperor started naming himself the headline attraction for the all-too-frequent games thrown during his reign. Now, Commodus was no slouch here. He was young and athletic, and seems to have taken his training seriously. He was an excellent shot, and handy with every kind of weapon imaginable. But there's no getting around the fact that he never did fight a fair fight. Obviously, you can't have the emperor going out there and getting killed by some random slave, so Commodus typically fought pre-wounded opponents, or, more commonly, opponents who had been given a lead sword to match up against the emperor's sharpened steel. These widely known secrets of the emperor's success made all his boasting about what a great warrior he was ring a bit hollow, and far from elevating his reputation, it made him the object of persistent, if private, mockery. Adding a malevolent edge to his somewhat ridiculous displays of alleged gladiatorial prowess was the fact that Commodus took particular delight in killing anything that seemed freakish. He would bring in midgets so he could pretend to be a mighty giant. He would bring in amputees and watch them hobble around feebly as he toyed with them. And at times, he would put his surgical skills to the test and slowly dismember victims while avoiding major arteries. His most famous routine, though, was the hunt, and in addition to the old reoccurring line about having slain 100 lions in a single day, he was fond of bringing in exotic oddities, ostriches, giraffes, elephants, and the like, and felling them with a few well-placed arrows. For a long time, the masses got a kick out of the ludicrous novelty of watching the emperor do horrible things to handicapped opponents, but the novelty of members of the Senate, meanwhile, at least the non-Commodus appointed members of the Senate anyway, there never was any novelty to begin with. The whole spectacle was an affront to the dignity of the emperor, the senators themselves, and the empire at large. Commodus suspected that if given a chance, his friends and colleagues in the Senate would find other places to be on game day, so he made attendance at his performances mandatory. That is, one of the quickest ways to find yourself on the emperor's hit list was to call in sick to the Colosseum. And when you found yourself on the emperor's hit list, it wasn't like he just didn't invite you to dinner or something. No, that meant the charges of treason, property confiscation, and execution were right around the corner. So the senators went and watched the emperor club cripples to death. Really, the whole thing was just cruel, pathetic, and sad. Meanwhile, the empire continued to plunge unchecked towards a system-wide failure. The legions, upon whom Commodus was in part resting the legitimacy of his reign, were beginning to slip away from him. At first, their ire was directed at the emperor's favorites, like Perennis, but as their dissatisfaction mounted, Commodus began to become an object of their anger as well. Commodus had dispatched Pertinax to Britain, which had been a recent hotbed of insubordination, with instructions to get the situation there back in hand. Pertinax was an old soldier who had earned his name and reputation putting out Rome's fires across the empire, and when he got to Britain,